Wie haben sich Ihre Mobilitätsgewohnheiten innerhalb der letzten Monate aufgrund von Covid und anderen Restriktionen verändert?
Asi moc jako vlastně se nějak nezměnily. Možná, že chodím víc pěšky, ale já myslím, že se vlastně vůbec nezměnily. Jo.
Hombre, camino mucho menos de lo que caminaba antes.
Eigenlijk niet. Nee. Helemaal niet. Weinig.
Spazieren gehen wir immer, aber so mit dem Roller heute das erste Mal haben wir ausprobiert.
Doncs pràcticament no s'ha modificat, només moure'm quan és necessari.
Pues prácticamente no cojo el coche, no cojo la moto, caminando y en patinete.
Önceden treni kullanıyordum ama artık daha çok yürüyüş ve Martı scooter ikilisiyle yürüyorum. Belki gerektiğinde de taksiye biniyorum ama genelde yürüyorum açık havada.
Chodím víc pěšky a i auto využívám více, než jsem využívala předtím.
Ben zaten evden çalışıyorum. Serbest çalıştığım için iş saatlerinde toplu taşıma kullanmıyorum. Şu anda da çok kullanmam gerekirse yoğun olmayan saatleri tercih etmeye çalışıyorum.
Změnili se tak, že nikam nejezdím. Sedím doma a hlavně chodím pěšky, když už tak.
Well, good morning and welcome to this session on successful mobility strategies during COVID time. So obviously quite a timely topic as the virus has been affecting all aspects of our life, the way we commute, the way we use active mobility, the way we use the car. So today we are going to ask the question of what has actually been the impact of the pandemic on mobility strategies, and most importantly, what make a successful mobility strategy at city level. So since the pandemic, we at the EIT Urban Mobility have been quite active, helping cities, supporting stakeholders facing the pandemic. We have had special projects on sustainable urban mobility. We also have launched a city survey asking cities what have they done to manage this pandemic. The city of Lund today on the panel participated on that. And today really we have great speakers with us to kind of put in perspective both the challenges and the opportunities that arise from the current situations we're in. So quick word about myself. My name is Yoann Petit. I'm working for the future mobility strategy at EIT Urban Mobility. The Factory's objective is to scale successful mobility solutions and to try and replicate it to more cities. With us today, we have a great range of speakers. So let me start and introduce Rossella Ferorelli. So Rossella is a city designer with the city of Milan. She actually manages active mobility and placemaking projects. We also have with us today Miquel Martí Casanovas. He is a doctor in urbanism, and actually he is assistant professor at the chair for urban and regional planning at the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. With us in this session as well, we have Mayne. Kevin is the CEO of Cycling Industries Europe, which is the voice of the cycling industry in Europe. And last but not least, we have Kisch with us. Peter manages the Future by Lund innovation platform at the city of Lund in Sweden. So now, without further ado, I will ask our speakers to start a series of short presentations, and I would like to start with you, Kevin, with your first presentation, if you want.
So, thank you, Yoann, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I think just by way of introduction, I think for anybody creating change in the urban environment, especially in transportation, I mean, it's easy to make statements about strategies. You know, it's extremely hard to then deliver those strategies when we're talking about real human beings changing their behaviors on a kind of daily basis. And in political terms, to reach out beyond that to what we might call the silent majority is even tougher. And, you know, we know from a cycling point of view, something like 60% of the population will cycle if they feel safe. But in Europe, only really the Netherlands and Denmark have cities where the population cycles at those levels at the moment. So, you know, we have a great challenge to mobilize our populations, even though the will is there. And then we've had this extraordinary experience, laboratory, test, call it what you will, which is the arrival of COVID. And then across Europe, and not just in those hotspots, the streets were available. The bicycles were available because the bike share companies took them on as public transport. You know, the air was cleaner, the children were safer. And that enabled us to show Europe what's possible if you have those conditions. And the population has responded, just like all the surveys have told us they would, to the point where we have not only people on the bikes, but we also had this burst of political confidence for the first time in a generation. And I can tell you today, you know, we've had over €1 billion of city-led pledges to more cycling. And I'm glad that some of those cities are on this call. And they've seen that benefit. And that's been good for the environment. It's good for the city economy. It's good for the European economy, because this is an industry where we lead the world. So I think going into today, that leaves us with a completely different question to the one we had a year ago. Because the question isn't, will this work? You know, will this work outside the Netherlands? The only question is, how fast do you actually want it to work? Because you can now apply all of these lessons with real world tracking, with real world evidence, with real world numbers of what's possible on certainly active mobility and what you can do with your streets, with all the benefits that brings. And I think the eyes of the world is actually on Europe to not only deliver that, but also deliver the complementary innovations and business models and ways of working. So I think it's been an awful time, obviously, for so many of us, but it's actually been an exciting time to be in this kind of living laboratory and to prove, really, really prove what we've known all the way along. So, you know, we are proud of the work we've done in the last 12 months as a sector, and now ready to kind of let's take these strategies forward.
Thank you, Kevin, for sharing these insights and also putting basically really pointing at, okay, how fast does this transition need to happen? Looking now at Rossella for the next presentation.
Yes, thank you all for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I would like to share a short presentation. So this is what I've been telling in every one of these post-COVID meetings lately, and it's that the cities have learned a lot from this first 6 months, let's say, history of these pandemics. And the most important lessons I consider to be learned still in the course of learning is how to, let's say, achieve a more conscious and aware approach to fighting against pandemics that it's huge is huge worldwide, let's say. So from the first phase, when we reacted to this new condition in a sort of panic style, passively, basically just contracting the existing right to public realm and public space, and we were very close to the risk to surrender to private mobility. Compared to this very first phase action, we changed our approach increasingly and gradually towards fighting the pandemics with curiosity and with a more active and strategic defense approach. Basically trying to expand the public domain to restore the, let's say, the per capita access to public space and sustainable mobility. Milan is working a lot. It's been working very densely since March with this strategy of adaptation. This is basically made of the construction of pop-up bike lanes and the opening of new public spaces in the urban space. Several programs have been activated, and a couple of these are financed by EIT, namely Clear and Furnish, and I'll be showing just a couple of images for each of one. Clear is working on classical public spaces by creating new squares, new plazas for people, subtracting redundant spaces from streets and giving it back to pedestrian use. In these images, you see how Piazza Meniti, one of the central spaces in the city, is being transforming in these very few days. And this is a proposal from an artist and the participatory work we are doing with citizens to realize this new intervention. This is what's happening in these very days in the city. You can see the place gradually being pedestrianized. And the second project I would like to show you a couple of images about is Furnish. This is led by Carnet in Barcelona. And this is about building open source, COVID-proof new experimental urban furniture to be able to live in public space even under a pandemic spectrum, let's say. And so these are some of the proposals that are being realized by 7 makers groups all around Europe. This is just some previews. Very quickly, this is happening in Milan now under a very huge bridge in the center. This is crossing all the center of the city. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rossella, for your presentation, and indeed a very nice glimpse into 2 of these great projects. Now, Miquel, would you like to start with your presentation?
Thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel from the Department of Urbanism of the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. We would like to bring to this discussion an academic perspective, a kind of overview on the challenges facing urban mobility, based on 20 years of studying the transformations of public space, first in Barcelona and then in different European cities. Reclaiming road space to be used for other civic purposes is an ongoing process in the end of the 70s, at one moment where most public spaces in Europe were invaded by cars. Maybe in some cities about between 70 and 80% of public space was road space. During the 80s and the 90s, the recovery of public space was driven by an architectural and urban design approach aiming to improve placemaking. And this led to the current situation, where maybe the balance between road space in public spaces is 50-50. And we should remember that this is the balance of the modern streets conceived in the mid-19th century as in the extensions after the first industrial revolution. This balance 50-50. But in the turning of the 21st century, the transformation of public space is driven by the paradigm of sustainability, and particularly the paradigm of sustainable mobility. The aim of reducing cars in cities respond both to environmental challenges, the mitigation of climate change by reducing emissions, and also improving health by reducing pollution, promoting physical activities, and favoring contact with nature. On the one hand, these environmental challenges, and on the other hand, societal choices. To build a city with less room for cars is to make more livable, more inclusive, more greener urban environments, with more quality of life, functioning at a low pace, with a more human scale. That's it, people-centered cities. Seeing this link between public space transformation and urban mobility, we started to tie our research on the study of urban mobility systems, all together with Carnet, which is a platform bringing together academy, public authorities, and industrial business companies. And we are working in projects, for instance, about new generation of intermodal hubs, which is clustering shared mobility and developing complementary services through new business models, that can be helpful to users of the hub, but also to the social community surrounding these hubs. This is one of our main activities. But at the same time, we are participating in studies funded by the EIT on the impact of COVID on the current challenges, requirements, and strategies of urban mobility. And today's session could be an opportunity to share with all of you some of the reflections about this general overview. Thank you.
Thanks, Miquel, for putting in perspective the recent urban mobility transformations. Peter, now, would you like to start your presentation?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Petit Kisch. I'm heading an innovation platform called Future by Lund in the city of Lund. It's a medieval town in the south of Sweden, close to Copenhagen, some 120,000 inhabitants, of which almost 50% are university people. And then combined with that, a lot of innovative companies. And I would say it's one of the most important innovation hubs in Sweden. Lund is, I think, the only town in Sweden that has been having a cumulative local GDP growth without having actually the growth in car use, because it's been very much focusing on pedestrian and cycling initiatives in the city. So I think in that context, we're quite unique in Sweden. I'm not a mobility expert. I work with innovation processes and concepts, but what we do is to link mobility to the city development as a whole. And some of the issues that we are working with are mainly related to electrification of transports, micro-mobility flows. That means quality flows for better lifestyle, healthier lifestyle, mobility as a service, and then also what we're trying to implement is a more sort of agile, incremental city planning, which could be branded as a real-time city, where we try to understand how people move and move around in the city in order to really understand the essence of mobility in the town. We also work quite a lot with some of the big companies and try to understand what's their mobility pattern and what they actually try to do. What we don't do so much is we don't focus much on logistics. So it's more about personal mobility. And that's roughly what we're trying to look in. And I think that the time we are in now is interesting because the COVID has actually opened up a fantastic possibility to shift and transform the essence of mobility. And I think that's really the interesting point we are now, where we can see the positive effects of or opportunities about we can reach with digitalization, but also really I think that the need for to maintaining human relations. So I think that we got a really interesting time now, and I think in this workshop we will maybe sort of touch upon the interesting subjects that are related to this development. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for this introduction. So now let's move to our first topic of discussion. I'd like to ask our speakers basically what have been the main transformations in the mobility space since the start of the pandemic. And I would first like to ask you, Rossella, from your placemaking and also designer perspective, what you think are these major transformations?
For the case of Milan, I'm witnessing a dramatic increase in bike use. And by dramatic, I really mean dramatic. I mean that compared to its size and also to its ambition as a European city, Milan has been dramatically under-equipped under the point of view of cycle mobility so far. So this incremental and tactical, let's say, pop-up bike lanes that we are realizing right in these months have been giving let's say, the citizens' response to a latent need that was partially unexpressed or underexpressed. So we are really seeing a difference in everyday, let's say, habits of the citizens. It's a really evident transformation.
Okay, so Rossella, you're speaking of latent needs in cities, and now I'm wondering, Miquel, because you've also looked at many diverse cities in a comparative way, is that also some of your findings?
Yes. Well, I think I would like, thinking about transformations, no? We could make a distinction between what have been evident short time and we expect temporary changes, no? Namely the need of social distancing, a commuting reduction, the stop of tourism and business traveling, for instance, so some short-term changes, to more, we don't know how more or less lasting transformations. No? I think in these lasting transformations can be some psychological effects, no? Like the prevention to be in contact with other people or to avoid the crowds. So this can mean permanent difficulty for public transportation use and eventual risk of modal shift back to personal travel, car travel, or for a risk for the reactivation of tourism, no? This psychological prevention to be in contact with other people. Then we can have the lasting effects of the economic crisis. Less economic activity maybe is less mobility. But one of the most important, I think, is the socioeconomic change, the impact of remote working. And maybe this is one of the deepest of the changes. No? I think the presence of online working in our labor market will increase significantly, and this can have many consequences. No? One, in the change of the location of people residences and firms, and all that the possible changes means in terms of daily mobility patterns. Then the reduction of commuting, or opportunity to flatten peak hours in the public transport use. No? So I think that the effects, the consequences of this remote working are important. So making this distinction between the short-term changes and these lasting transformations, I think that these lasting transformations can affect the underlying socioeconomic dynamics, the forces that shapes the mobility system, and then the mobility behaviors and patterns of people and goods. No? Now, I would think how these underlying forces relate with the vision of what's a sustainable future mobility, and we can maybe discuss this later. No? But I think that there are some lasting effects, but that impact on the underlying forces that have then effects on the mobility system.
For sure, and I'd like to pick up your points, Miquel, that you mentioned, especially on the impact on business traveling, on business behavior, and also on public transports. And looking at you, Peter, at the city of Lund, is that something that you have actually experienced, something that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any facts on actually the real time, the exact changes, but we can see. Now we don't know whether it's permanent change or if it's just sort of going to be a move back of the pendulum later on. But what we can see is that in some sectors we can see some real changes. In the commuting sector, of course, due to the fact of the risk of spreading, we can already see that there we have some indicative figures also that the work commuting is down to 20-25% of your total traveling time budget. So the essence of mobility is shifting from going to work to something else. We can see on the business trip, for instance, it's not so much about the figures, more what people are saying. When I talk to some of the bigger firms, they said that no way they're going to take the airplane to the main capital, Stockholm, for just a one-day trip. No way that we're going to take a sales trip that doesn't make sense. And they're actually putting some of the sales connections online and digital also. And I think that what we see is that fundamentally people, individuals, but also organizations are starting to question the essence of mobility. Why are we actually moving from one place to another in a larger context than we actually did before? So I think that you will have a differentiation in your mobility portfolio, that all the sort of the bad transportation or the bad mobility will sort of will be questioned. I mean, is it really worth it? Are we willing to pay for it? Because that's also an issue. The second impact you can see is that companies are starting to question the size of office space. We're talking about 50% reduction in office space in some companies. We can also see that the interest in buying larger houses with a small room that you can use as a working space is increasing. So I mean, you can actually see these changes. I don't know if it's going to be permanent, but you can sort of feel that something is moving. And this is, I think, it's a structural change, not only about which goes to in relation to mobility, but it's also how our economic system is designed. So something is happening, I think, and we are seeing some sort of ideas of what that might look like. A big question mark, a challenge, I think, is really what's going to happen to the public transport system, because who's going to pay for it if it's going to have more fluctuations? Is it going to be more difficult to predict who is traveling and not? So this is one of the sort of question marks that we have here in our region. So how are we going to sort of finance and maintain the public transportation system?
Okay, so a larger structural change, but with direct impact also on model shifts. Kevin, Rossella mentioned that in Milan there was a huge increase in cycling. Is that also something that you've seen in your data and from your conversations with your members?
Yeah, in fact, in responding to this question, that's the easiest question to answer. Yeah, cycling is universally up in Europe, in North America, so other trends, in any count, whether it's bike share usage, street count, allocation of space. But I actually think the most important thing is to respond to what everybody else has said, is that the transformation is actually a cultural shift in decision making. Now, it may be temporary, but if it's truly a cultural shift, the willingness of companies, of public bodies, to make faster, more strategic decisions in relation to mobility is possibly the biggest thing we will see from this whole COVID pandemic, because there are decisions made, they're under the banner of temporary, but they've been made in a way, to close streets, to cars, to close, to make decisions about offices and locations, to effectively change the mobility pattern of entire populations in an instant. And that, that has genuinely never been done before. It never happened under the things like the 2008 to 2012 recession. That was creeping death, in so many economies. And it took 4 or 5 years to work its way through. We are talking about decisions that were made, from 1 week to the next. And even an institution like the European Union is saying, we will put nearly 700 billion euros into this recovery, and it must be spent in 2 years. The decision must be made in a matter of weeks and months. And so at every level, the decision making and that kind of cultural shift. And if we tackled climate change and air quality and other kind of economic pressures of mobility with the same urgency, we would be looking at the European Union's target of a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 with optimism. And that's what excites me. And that's, I think, the transformative change of the moment. And perhaps I share with other colleagues, I just hope that is not temporary. I kind of believe it should not be temporary. And I believe, of course, that cycling could be a winner in that solution. But above all else, will this willingness to move fast stay with us? And if it is, I'm quite excited. And I really hope it becomes a feature. Because then I say we go back to the climate change and air quality targets, and we believe they're achievable. And I don't think historically anybody really believed that the mobility sector would deliver its share of CO2 reduction or emissions reductions. I think they do believe it now.
Thank you, Kevin, for putting so eloquently the different crises looming on our society. We've already touched a bit upon it, about the challenges sparked by the crisis, but also about some of the opportunities. But I'd like us to dive a bit deeper into this opportunity and challenges, it's almost dichotomy, and really to look at the sustainable mobility transition and to think of this transition in the light of what we have experienced for now almost the past year. And I'd like to ask you, Miquel, because you've looked at many use cases in comparison. There is this study you mentioned on the impact of the various mobility strategies. And so through your research and through your conversations, were you able to kind of identify some of the challenges that are common to a lot of cities, and perhaps also some of the opportunities to accelerate the transition to more sustainable mobility?
Yes, I think that the current situation can be clearly an opportunity, and is being an opportunity in many cities to consolidate and to accelerate some ongoing transition towards sustainable mobility, as has been said. So I think if the goals of the transition are clear, and I think they are not contested by the challenges that the COVID is facing us, cities should be able to use the short-term measures to face COVID to foster long-term strategies and changes that they were ongoing and implemented. Let me think about 5 of them. For instance, first is tactical urbanism. Tactical urbanism as a temporary reclaimed road space for widening sidewalks or more room for bar terraces can lead to a permanent redesign of public space to improve neighborhood walkability. So what is temporary, tactical, can become a permanent redesign. Then the urgently development of the bike network, that we have seen sometimes at the urban level, but in other times in terms of interurban corridors in many cities, which is a response to the decreased capacity of the public transportation, can consolidate this mode of transport, the bicycles, as the key model in share for journeys up to 15 kilometers, maybe, which are a big percentage of the daily movements in most cities. Second one, as we were saying, the transformation of bicycle as one of the main transport modes. There is also the rise of the e-commerce or the home deliveries that have exponentially increased because of the pandemic, and that can propel cities to implement measures to improve the urban freight transport. It's another possible change. Or the time factor management, which is an important aspect in the management of public space. It has emerged as a key to deal with the pandemic. The fact that, for instance, the time slots to exit the streets during the lockdown. And this points the interest of time regulations to share some public spaces. Depending on the time, we can use the public space for parking, we can use it for loading and loading areas, we can use it for public transport. So this sharing the space tied to the time management factor. Or finally, maybe a more intangible one, and we could think about others, but is how neighborhood life under restrictions with less cars on the streets can raise the social awareness of the quality of life associated to a cleaner, calmer environment. And so also this is very important in the sense that this awareness that citizens can embrace in some way this vision on what's sustainable future mobility with a different kind of city, a different kind of quality of life in the city. So I think it's clear that we can find short-term changes that can be taken advantages as opportunity to really reach this transition.
Yeah, you've mentioned tactical urbanism and also the importance of public spaces. So I now really have to look at you, Rossella, thinking of all this topic and as an urban designer. Would you say that basically the momentum is now there for a city redesign, or would you say it's a bit more complicated than that?
Sure, at least I hope so. In fact, I really have to share the trustful mood of Kevin's intervention before Kevin's speech. I really believe that we are now in the moment of, let's say, an acceleration and also a polarization of social phenomena. This is the very nature of this kind of enormous, let's say, global social phenomena. And so I really understand and share Kevin's point of view about the acceleration and also the polarization of political decisions in these days. And I cannot stop but thinking about the effect of this acceleration on the need to take huge and historical decision about, for example, climate changes and the other, let's say, elephants in the room that we have in this era. And so these are very, in my opinion, very interesting dynamics that open to, let's say, that push towards a more progressive thinking and somewhat towards some realistic utopic thinking. So it's like utopia has become some sort of necessity, and this is a very, very social and philosophical, let's say, effect that is really unwitnessed. It's a really typical phenomenon of these very days. And still there are some risks, of course, and as well I share Kevin's opinion about the fact that the worst, the biggest risk today is go back to the status quo, actually. So the risk is changing nothing and going back to what was before. And I would like also to mention what Miquel was mentioning about the huge expansion of e-commerce, and not only on its effects on, of course, economy that are completely dramatic, but also on mobility, for example, for all the logistic of last mile mobility and delivery, which is impacting hugely on our cities. So this is changing a lot. And there are things that can be changed with tactical, light and reversible intervention like tactical urbanism, and things that are not. But the very important thing is that we work together between different approaches and different interventions.
Thank you, Rossella. And you mentioning the expansion of e-commerce and then the need for urban delivery is almost a natural transition to Kevin. So I would like to ask you, Kevin, yeah, what do you think in this term of accelerating change? Where are the bottlenecks you might see, and what are other levels that can get us there?
Well, what's really enjoyable, exciting, I suppose, about being on this call is to listen to Rossella, Miquel, Petit, talking about human and local change. And we are not having conversations, frankly, about gadgets. We've not talked about anything that flies. We've not talked about, forcing autonomous widgets and digits and gadgets and things into cities. The conversations are all about the human scale and the human economic impacts, and the word space comes up endlessly. And that is, almost taking us back to, our European forebears in, the Greek and Roman love of the open space in history. And we're bringing that back. And as long as those words frame the way we think, we can't let our public bodies and even our, innovation partners, and no disrespect to others, get sucked into the idea we need gadgets to fix this. Now, our industry is working extremely hard in making bikes more accessible. We put a bit of electric assist on the bikes. We make them shareable. we make cargo bikes possible for small business to do what Rossella and Miquel have talked about in e-commerce. But we want that to happen so that a local shop can do e-commerce to its local customers and not have to run vans in and out of the city centre and make things, so it makes things better, not worse, and it makes the local economy better, not worse. But it's all about encompassing that kind of human scale. And so I think that's what COVID has done to some extent, but it keeps telling us to not get distracted. And it's along with that short time scale. Please, you know, from our sector, we just don't see a demand for gadgets. We see a demand for access, and we see a demand for solutions. And that's what, I mean, I love working in this sector because it, you know, it's a 200-year-old piece of technology that is eminently modern in what it's doing today, and it is enough. It is not in, it doesn't need to be automated, and it doesn't need to fly unless you're, you know, putting an ET movie on, then bikes can fly. We all love that. But in what we're doing today, you know, we have these real practical solutions delivering right now, and this is the opportunity to do what works, to give the wonderful public space that Rossella showed in her pictures and just give it back to the citizens. We don't have to reinvent public space. We actually have it in our cities. We just got to give it to people.
Thanks, Kevin, for putting this in perspective, human scale, local economies. Is it in the city of Lund, Peter, I'm looking at you, is it also something that you've sensed? So you've talked previously a bit about the challenges regarding public transport, but now looking at public spaces and also the use of public spaces and perhaps the local economy, do you see here again any challenges that the pandemic has brought with it at your city level, and do you see any of the opportunity perhaps to drive this human and very local change forward?
I think that it depends on if we're talking about, I think that when we're talking about new development areas, I think that the ideas that we're talking about here are on the way to be implemented. We're fundamentally questioning the prioritization of cars, redesign of public space. All that is moving ahead. I think, however, I think that our big challenge is what is already in the built infrastructure or the existing infrastructure, and also how we use investments in general. I would say both road investments, infrastructure investments, all that. There is a big question mark. I mean, okay, if we're not supposed to build more roads, what are we? How do we invest that money instead? And I think that maybe you need to reinvest that infrastructure money into sort of local space or local communities to sort of redesign. If we're talking about redesigning, we need to use the sort of traditional money in a new way. And I think we have a big discussion here, because if we look at the National Road Administration and also our politicians in general, they talk about these things on what we should be doing, prioritizing walking, cycling, public space and all that. But then at the end of the day, eventually we got a fourth lane on the highway instead of only having not only three is enough. We need to have a fourth lane on the highway. And I think that we also need to sort of target and the fundamental that drives development. That means the investments. So how can we sort of reallocate that sort of power into doing what we are talking about? And I think that's a big challenge we have with the public money that we are talking about. But I mean, if I look at examples, we have pilots and examples on what we should be doing. I don't think that we lack examples. We lack the scaling up and the broader implementation, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for sharing this city perspective and also bringing the topic of investment. which we haven't touched upon to our discussion. I would now like to move to our third topics, which is really about what are the key ingredients that basically make successful mobility strategies. And directly looking at you, Kevin, from your business perspective, what would you say is like currently needed to foster innovation in your business environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the EIT context, it's a good question too. I mean, the current structure from our point of view is completely unbalanced. And if you take, for example, support for innovation, institutional support, like clusters and centers and technology centers. I mean, I'm aware of about 4 or 5 cycling centers in Europe, and I'm aware of hundreds of automotive clusters, all getting public money poured into them. So the balance is wrong. And if the EU and national governments and the innovation community wants to fix that, they have to fix the institutional imbalance. And of course, I hope that things like EIT Urban Mobility have brought money in to support change, and we can have that conversation here. But we really have to understand that the system, and I think Peter's description about where the investments go, it's currently wrong. And urban mobility in particular has been the poor relation. International, interurban, highway, freight, maritime, aviation, and automotive have all the money. The cities have all the opportunities. There's something wrong with that equation.
Thanks, Kevin, for very clear statement of priority here. Peter, as you manage the innovation platform of the city of Lund, what would you say basically works best to foster innovation in the current times? So what are the key ingredients for it?
Well, I don't have the magic solution, but I think that one of the points that I would like also to underline what Kevin is saying, that you need to redirect money from the existing sort of paradigm that you sort of continue to pour in money into the automotive sector. I mean, we have Volvo and Scania that are pretty big players in Sweden, and it's very easy for them to attract innovation money. So I think that we need to have more risk money, not only I think biking, walking solutions definitely, but also for mobilities as a service solutions in general. I think so that's redirecting innovation investments for sure. The other thing I think we need to think of is really that we need to some point, I think sometimes we talk about mobility as isolated, but really reframing and understanding why are we moving, what's the point, and sort of integrating that into our living, our work life, and also when it comes to logistical questions. I mean, the challenges we have with last mile transports, can we sort of integrate them in a different way into the local life, etc., etc. So integrating mobility into what is the sort of essence of cities. I think that's the, and then involving players. I mean, in our case, we work quite a lot with real estate owners, with employers, and get them to understand that they can actually affect and design and innovate around mobility as a part of what they are offering to their employees or to the customers. I think that not only talk about mobility as something that you're planning from the city, that's important, but it's not enough. So how do we engage sort of these players that use mobility in the daily operational way of working? I think that's incremental. And then also for us individuals who live in the city, really rethink what's the essence of mobility, why do we do it? And then to get them on board in different ways. And now if that's sort of via pilots or living labs or whatever you call it, doesn't matter, but try to get a momentum and get them involved in that sort of mobility change. That's very important.
Okay, so important to get momentum for change here across the board. Thank you. Miquel, could you briefly outline from your experience and the cities you've looked at, what are like some patterns of success in kind of driving this?
I think that, as Kevin says, innovation in governance is as much important as the technological innovation. No? At this moment, it's one of the cornerstones. And it's to create these synergies between multiple stakeholders, no? Which are not only the traditional public and private, but also the social communities and the citizens themselves. And this is not an easy task. And I think that to involve the social communities, there is a triple way, no? A triple role that the citizens can play. First of all, as citizens that should contribute to define and update this vision, no? What Peter is calling the essence of the urban mobility transition, no? How make citizens participate in building this vision. Second, as users, and I think is more and more important, the feedback of users is crucial to improve some mobility solutions. And third, as actors of some mobility solutions, no? In which, for instance, shared mobility or on-demand flexible public transport. So I think that to create these complex ecosystems is one of the most fundamental challenges we have to make possible the transition towards sustainable mobility.
Thank you, Miquel. So yeah, importance of citizen participation and Rossella, how in your experience, how important is actually citizen participation in making projects successful?
Yeah, I totally agree with Peter and Michael on the topic of engagement, and I will just briefly add that I'm very interested in this sort of idea of working on the expansion of public rights, and therefore intending the possibility provided by public mobility and sustainable mobility in this direction. So just about going back to the philosophical and societal value of mobility itself, from in some way from mobility as a service to mobility as a right.
Perfect. I like that. Mobility as a service, mobility as a right. That's nice. Okay, let's move on to our last question of this session. Well, I would like to ask you actually, what, according to you, does it take to actually scale change, to replicate change across cities or across sectors? Peter, I would like to ask this question to you first. What do you think is needed for replication and scaling of successful solutions, be it in governance or in,
Yeah, well, that's not an easy question because I think that, like Miquel is saying, mobility is a very complex area to work in. You got all lessons all the way from individual behavior all the way up to politics and policy. So it's very difficult to give one answer. I think it depends on what we're talking about, what we want to scale up. It could be sort of practices, it could be knowledge, it could be individual solutions. I think that you need to look into each sort of every part of what you want to scale up. And how you actually do that, because I think depending what you want to scale up, you will have different scaling up possibilities. And I also think that some things are not scalable in the way they are piloted in one place, because sometimes cities are very specific conditions, making it very difficult to scale up and change. So I think that it depends. I know that is maybe not the answer you want to have, but I can see that on a very specific technical solution, yeah, it's very easy to have that sort of, maybe it's a smaller company, he can go to another place and he can sell it, or through a consultancy they can replicate it, or etc. But when you're talking about more systemic transformations, it's not all that easy. I can just give you an example of that. For 15 years ago, that there was a quite big ambition by the Swedish state to sell Swedish innovation solutions to China. Basically, big systems, big cities, just to implement the way they have done it in Sweden. And if you take, for instance, the waste collection system, It's very effective in Sweden, but it also relies heavily on that each individual actually sort waste at their home. So you have a cultural sort of behavioral thing that has been sort of implemented over since you started school, and then you have technological solutions combined with that, and that doesn't happen just moving that to another country. If you don't have the behavioral change, you can't get use of the Swedish technology. So the whole thing sort of failed in that sense, I would say. So I think replication is difficult. Is you should sort of treat it with respect, but it's doable. But you need to pinpoint what is it actually want to scale up and move to another city.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Kevin, what is your view on?
I mean, I think our members are absolutely clear. You know, we have solutions. We welcome kind of innovation, but at the city level, will you stop reinventing the wheel on the basics? You know, if every business model and every basic contract and every template we have to fill in to get a license to run a small bike share scheme is different, the whole thing is completely unscalable. So the outcome is entirely scalable, and there is a kind of Europe or national wide need to standardize things on data and regulations and templates, and then apply local innovation to how it may be delivered or to your local outcomes. But don't mix up the two things. So we'd never take away cities' need to satisfy their own local needs. That's crucial, and we've learned that. But we are losing so much public money, time, energy on the bureaucracy. It's crippling.
Thank you for this perspective. Rossella, what is basically your view from the placemaking perspective? Because I think local conditions are also very important here.
Yeah, from my personal experience, we are working much with the City Club, within the City Club inside EIT. And in general, I really like to think to Europe as a community of practices, but really a community led by cities. In this community, every good practice or transfer network of any sort makes the difference. And I've been joining several, and this works particularly good, let's say, especially when the exchange of practices comes between very different regions. Because that apparently such different contexts share few needs, the experience are very different, but in the end, it's very useful to, let's say, go back to the roots of projects and politics. And so to share what is basic to all of this and grow together. This has been working a lot in my experience.
Okay, thanks for Rossella. And now, Miquel, do you have any perspective to share here?
So I think that nowadays the best practices are accessible, no, and shared, but the problem of replication for me are two main reasons that make difficult this replication. One is, has been said, the mobility ecosystem is different in each metropolis. No? So the urban model, the daily mobility patterns, the supply chains typologies. So, and for this, I think are important the projects that are developing toolkits for supporting decision-making processes that take into account this difference between different cities. No? So this can be dealt with this kind of project. But at the same time, the replicability of a good practice is difficult because of the synergies. That they need local synergies between stakeholders. No? And this depends on personal attitudes, on social dynamics, on bureaucracy burdens. So I think that in that sense makes that the replication of good practices, it's a difficult point.
Thank you, Miquel, for sharing your views on this. So now, as a way to conclude, I would like to ask each speaker for a 1 minute small speech sharing their view of basically what needs to happen to accelerate the transition in the very short term, think next year. And I would like to start with you, Kevin.
I can only repeat what I've said earlier. Let's start with what's working, has worked, is is available and can be done now in our cities, because the proof is there that it can deliver remarkable change quickly. And therefore it's the bedrock of fast transition. But of course, speaking to an innovation community, where should we innovate? And there I share the view with colleagues. Let's innovate on implementation. Let's innovate on better funding. And let's innovate on actually getting it to people. And that means to everybody, not just your smart cities, not just your rich cities, not just the people who are so minded. We are a long way from taking the lessons of 2020 to every city in Europe and to every city in the world. So, and to many cities, that is their innovation. It's to take it from the forerunners that we've heard about today and spread it. So what works, and then innovate on getting it to more people and more places.
Thanks, Kevin. Peter, do you want to go next?
I agree with Kevin. I think we need to make the job done. It's the situation we have now is the fantastic opportunity to implement and change. I think there is an interest and willingness to do things differently right now, and let's use that opportunity and free space to really change things in more cities than just few ones.
Thank you, Peter. Miquel?
Yes, for me to conclude, three main ideas. The first one is that I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has not challenged substantially the vision for a sustainable mobility, leading to a more environmental friendly and people-centered cities. This has not changed. On the contrary, many short-term measures and changes implementing to face the pandemic can be seen as opportunities to foster many of the long-term strategies we were exploring. And finally, I think that innovation in governance, searching for the development of cooperative mobility ecosystems involving public, private, social stakeholders is one of the cornerstones to reach this transition.
Thanks, Miquel. Rossella?
Yeah, I totally agree with Miguel. As an urban designer, I work in a field where, let's say, urban mobility meets architectural and landscape design. So what I would like to see happen in the next few days or weeks is a closer look to the direct relationship between nature and culture, and therefore nature and cities. So even in the field of urban mobility, I would like to see, and I would like to work with mobility within a wider ecosystemic mindset, a generally diffused ecosystemic mindset.
Well, what a great conclusion. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you to people who watched us online. And of course, the urban mobility discussion continues at the EIT Urban Mobility Summit. And I really hope you would enjoy the upcoming sessions. Thank you.